I'm Candace Montgomery. I'm a co-founder and co-executive director of Black Visions, a Black, queer, and trans-led organization building power within Black communities to dismantle systems of violence. I'm excited to guest edit this issue of The Forge, an online journal on organizing strategy and practice, along with Solana Rice, executive director of Liberation in a Generation, and my co-director at Black Visions, Miski Noor. We'll be looking back at the uprisings last summer and the longer movement to defund and abolish the police and prison industrial complex. I'm here today with Kayla Reed, the executive director of Action St. Louis, a grassroots organization that was founded after the Ferguson uprising that leads campaigns to divest from carceral systems, fight for electoral justice, and invest in social programs like housing. Action St. Louis also led the successful campaign to close the workhouse prison in St. Louis. We talk about Kayla's work in St. Louis, the relationship between movements and organizations, the role of money in our work, and our duty to win. Listen in. So the question we're asking everybody first, just to kick off these interviews, is what is your vision for safety that would replace policing and imprisonment?
Yeah, I have been baptized in this, like, what is abolition? How do we practice it in places like St. Louis, where we have a lot of violence, right? Where there's a lot of intracommunal violence, gun violence, domestic violence. And it's, you know, it is a product of decades and centuries of divestment, right? And intentional neglect of our people and our communities. And so how do we radically reimagine investment and building back communities, centering justice is like, that's the dream. And so when I think about, you know, our campaign to close a jail, people often say like, well, if there's no jail, where do people go? And our answer is like, they go home. They go to a place where they can have sustainability and stability, where their wellness is holistic. It's not just measured by what they produce or what they earn, but we're thinking about the mental, physical, social, and economic well-being of entire people and entire families. And I think that as we invest in that, when we invest in that for the first time, because we've never done that in our communities, never had that, have never had that as an option, there's less need, reliance, desire, you know, wherever folks are on the spectrum of abolition for police. And so, you know, I think about really the arc of our divest invest framework is about proving that when people have what they need, there is less harm, and there is more space to create pathways for accountability that don't rely on punitive solutions. And so what does counseling look like? What does therapy look like? What does community counsel look like? What is restorative justice toward making sure that the person who did harm and the person that was harmed feel in their fullness and their dignity at all times, and that the community is able to progress and learn from this moment and prevent those things from happening again from those lessons.
Thank you for that. I mean, the common theme in all of these interviews has been about care and like the vision being about one in which we care for folks. So it's just like very profound for me. And so the next thing I want to ask, thinking about how you tend to your local, you know, is like coming out of a community that really led the world, and felt the impacts of an uprising locally. What is your assessment of movement infrastructure that is needed to sustain today's momentum, to actually be able to fight for, you know, this vision of real care for folks?
Yeah, you know, I think I didn't come into movement as a builder, right? So I learned on the job what movement was, what it could be, what it wasn't, what it shouldn't do. And I'm still learning that. I think it's a lifelong learning process. But when I was a pharmacy technician the day Mike Brown got killed, and went to Ferguson, with Tef, who is, who I'm still in relationship with. We're still friends, and we talk about this a lot. What happens to a place that sparks a rebellion, right? And that's what it was. It was a rebellion against the state, right? The police murdered this young man, and we watched his mom, his family mourn out loud, and there was a visceral response. And the response was in part because there was this incident of extreme violence, right, and degradation, and the fact that his body laid there for hours in the hot summer sun in St. Louis. And that felt like, that harkened back to lynchings, and where bodies just were on display for hours after someone was murdered by this white violence. But then there was this common relation to the interaction that I think every Black person in St. Louis understood. To be Black in St. Louis at that time, and in the county specifically, if you made it to 18, you were stopped by the police. It wasn't an odd story, the encounter where police were, occupying our neighborhoods. They were a terrorizing force. And then there was this escalation of extreme violence that resulted in Mike Brown losing his life. And there was no accountability. There felt like there was not going to be accountability for it. And so I don't think we knew it was an uprising until people gave us that word, right? We were responding to this injustice, and the demands evolved as we evolved. At first, it was about learning the officer's name, indicting the officer, convicting the officer. And now, years and years later, none of us equate justice as a judicial process, right? Or as the criminal and legal proceedings of an officer when they kill someone. And so part of how I think about movement building is it's about stepping into the fact that there is consistent evolution of thought, of theory, of practice. And so you have to be willing to be transformed in the work, right? As like Mary Hook says, but and that self-transformation is just as hard as the movement building piece. It's just as complicated because movement raises contradictions. It raises contradictions. It exposes lack of analysis. It exposes where there is a lack of rigor and commitment to transformative visions. It heightened personalities. It exposes the good and bad of people. If you were a narcissist before movement, you're going to be an extreme narcissist in movement. If you were a quiet, person before movement, it's likely on the other side of it, you're going to want to be more of that, right? It gives you more. And so, when people ask me, when there's another instance of uprising that happens, like similar to Minneapolis last summer, a lot of folks are like, okay, St. Louis went through this. Let me call people we know. And I tell them, I try to be as honest as I can be to say that there are two things that are going to happen. People are going to choose a side. They're going to choose to do the movement building piece of it, or they're going to choose to do the kind of moment piece of it. The moment piece is I'm in the streets for these 2 weeks, and then I'm away, right? Like whatever had happened in those streets impacted me, but I chose not to stay. And then there are many roles that group will take after that, right? That they will be silent supporters of movement, silent critiquers of movement, people who just completely left and don't want to talk about it around movement at all. And then there are people who lean in. There are people who get baptized and they they're like, I want to be in the church. I want to be here. I joined, I'm ready, put me where I need to go. And those folks, there are always less of those folks than the folks who are in the moment building. And for those folks who choose to be in the work of the movement building after an uprising, what I would recommend is that folks prioritize healing and that deep relationship building, because you're going to be tried. You're going to be tried. Your leadership is going to be tried. Your development is going to be tried. Your relationships are going to be tried. And there's so much trauma that comes out of those moments that if we don't take time to heal the foundation, what we build is always at risk of collapsing. And we should know that as we head into the part of movement, like as we get ready to head into movement building.
What a word. I mean, that literally leads right into my next question is like, why do movements need organizations? And I ask that because I think that that's up for debate. And I think that the ways that social media, social media, mainstream media spin the narrative of how movements have happened in the past and how they're happening now doesn't always give us that answer really clearly. So I'm curious for you, why do movements need organizations, or do they?
Yeah. Yes, I am firmly in the church that there is no movement without strong organizations, right? Strong leaders build strong campaigns that build strong organizations that build strong movements. And the reason we do that, because if movements are built on organizations, organizations can't be destroyed as easily as a leader, right? And so if you put a movement on a person, if you remove that person, you have stopped the movement, right? Like essentially that's what we conflate when we say individual people do it. Now I think how we define organization can be expansive, right? An organization, I am a preacher's kid, so I rely on scripture to communicate things. An organization can be 2 or 3 people touching and agreeing on the same thing, right? That can be an organization. It could be a collective. It could be a working group, some form of people being organized in the same direction with a commitment to a set of values and beliefs that guide their work. That can look like everything from a block unit to a national organization with chapters and everything in between. And some people have flattened what the word organization means. We have given it a formal definition to match what capitalism or our nonprofit industrial complex has explained it to be, where you're only an organization if you have 501c3 status or staff or et cetera. And that's not true. And a movement has to be an ecosystem of these different variants of variations rather of those organizations. But we have to have collective, because if we don't have collectives, then what we run the risk of doing is defining what the win looks like based on our personal positionality, right, and our personal perception. And so when you have a collective, you're likely to understand more than one point of view, more than one lived experience, more than one analysis, and you're able to identify the common threads and the tensions and the contradictions and struggle together toward moving forward, right? And so I think about how important the intervention has been around queer and trans folks in this iteration of movement, right? Because if we didn't have that intervention, if we didn't lift up those contradictions around who gets to lead movement and how movement is ran and who are we fighting for when we say Black liberation, we run the risk of producing, that movement will produce something akin to oppression for other folks. It'll prioritize a subset of folks who don't have variation in their experience. And so I think when we think of movement, we have to think about a constellation of organizations that you can have different, and those organizations are made up of different people who have different experiences, and they struggle to identify that vision together. Yeah, so I think it's absolutely necessary, and it's the hardest part of movement building. But I think in the way I believe in Black liberation is that if we don't struggle now, once we're on the other side of something like capitalism or white supremacy or cis heteropatriarchy, we run the risk of replicating it or reproducing it because we didn't struggle on this side to understand how those systems impact more than just my perspective, right? More than just my experience.
Yes to constellations, making up our movements, or like we talk about in ecosystems or whatever. And I think that point around like, this is also why, because we're able to pull in all these different people,
Yeah.
is critical. And so how do we build movements in which we don't also see those as a threat, when we see
Yeah.
other folks building those entities? I think that's the other big question that we have, and especially coming out of uprising, which I know y'all saw in Ferguson and St. Louis. We've seen it here in Minneapolis, the surge of resources and the ways that organizations in their flattened sense have been pitted against each other is an important piece.
Mm-hmm.
And in all of that, we have to sustain ourselves.
Yep.
We have to figure out how to bring all of our pieces together. We have to hold all of these different complex and, like you said, contradicting things. So what is your advice for organizers on how they sustain themselves, and what lessons did you learn the hard way?
Money is political by virtue of like us living under a capitalist, in a capitalist society. And so because we live in a system that exploits people for, labor and to generate wealth, money within oppressed communities is always going to raise contradictions. It's always going to be hard to talk about, right? Whether to negotiate, right? And to share. It's always going to be that. Like the first thing I tell people about money is like, when it comes, you don't have to make a decision right away. The thing that we can't do is let money dictate our strategy, right? Like our money can expand our tactics, but it shouldn't dictate our strategy. And sometimes we prioritize money over everything else. And money can't be more important than relationships. It can't be more important than political education. It can't be more important than development. And if those things slow us down, I'd rather be slow and right than fast and wrong, right? Because when you are in the position to be stewards of movement, which is what organizers are, when you decide to join an organization as a member, or all the way up, right, to the executive director, or all the way across, if you don't have a hierarchical structure, everyone is opting in. There's like that box at the bottom: by signing this, you agree to the terms and conditions. The terms and conditions of movement building are to be stewards of this movement, that we will do what is necessary to protect it. That means checking ourselves, that means checking each other, that means checking organizations. That does not mean destroying, right? Stewards don't destroy. Stewards sustain. They remove what is bad, they add what is good, but they do not destroy. So let me say that part. If someone watches this that needs to hear it, stewards don't destroy, period. And if you are in movement, the goal should not be to destroy. It should be to sustain and grow. And that means you get deep into some tension moments. Somebody might walk away, something might leave. An organization may even decide it doesn't need to exist. It may sunset, but the movement continues. And so we can't conflate money and movement. We got to separate that. And we got to understand that that if our movement is about the well-being of Black folks, then absolutely people should be paid to do this work. If we believe people should be paid, like people should have what they need. And we should not sacrifice or belay or overwork and under-resource folks who are in this movement, because as stewards, our responsibility is to sustain. And if we're not creating an environment where folks are able to sustain themselves, they will not sustain movement. They will resent movement. And that is when destruction becomes the option over stewarding movement. Now sustaining, this is also a relevant piece, right? And as an ED, I make more than anyone in my organization, right? Like that is the truth. I'm not uncomfortable saying that, and I understand the privilege in that. And I also understand that as a steward who has been assigned a particular leadership role, I have to be thinking about sustaining other people at all times. not just myself, and sustaining the organization. So I'm not opposed to people sustaining themselves, because that's long-term work for the movement. We have watched our elders die with nothing. We have watched our leaders struggle to live. And if we believe that Black people should thrive on the other side of white supremacy and capitalism, then we believe that they should thrive right now. And we have to create those conditions, and create accountability around those conditions, so that the focus is to sustain and not to replicate capitalism, but to sustain movement as we seek to dismantle.
I mean, I think that's such an important piece, because that question could have gone so many different ways, but you really just speaking to like, let's actually sustain the people who are helping to hold it in a way that aligns with our values. Just like really straightforward too, you know?
I think it's hard. It was hard in Ferguson, right? A lot of money came into St. Louis. Certain groups got it, other groups didn't, you know, and that's hard, because we all were in the streets. We all were in the streets. And again, some people chose to moment build and others chose to movement build. That's a self decision, right? That's a self decision. But what we didn't figure out is that when those people who decided to movement build or moment build, there was no process of healing. There was no process of coming to a shared table to like figure it out. And so then we fell into this space, if I'm being honest, of like a have and a have not binary around movement building. And then from each position, people developed the message around if they had or if they didn't have, right? And so folks who didn't have said, I'm still here, so you don't have to have money to be here, right? You shouldn't have to be paid to do this work. And people who had were saying, I believe in this work, the money didn't bring me here, and people should be taken care of. But then they didn't talk to each other. And we just have to be honest in saying that movement building by a bunch of if I may, by a bunch of niggas who didn't have money before, that's tight. You know, like that's hard. That's so hard. And it's so difficult. And that part is like, we don't give each other space to just like, or grace to be like, I actually don't think you're trying to destroy movement. Let's figure it out. We don't say that to each other. I disagree with what you're doing, but I don't think you want to destroy movement. Let's figure it out. We conflate bad decisions with lack of values, right? And I think that's a bad decision. And many of us, when we start leadership, are not as developed as we are. In retrospect, who I am now was not who I was in 2015. And I would judge myself harshly from where I am now with the things I felt, did, said, believed in 2015. And if movement is about making the space, sustaining it long enough for people to be transformed in the work, we got to make space to hold the bumpiness of that transformation. We can't police it in a particular direction or force it to look a particular way. We got to make space for people to form into the steward that they were meant to be, and understand that there's going to be tensions and contradictions and complications in that. And we have to have something that feels a lot like restorative and caring and transformative grace as we pursue justice too.
And that's the word on sustaining yourself. I mean, I think that so much of what I hear is like, it's also that pause to like be reflective enough to be like, okay, what all are the pieces that are going on here? Because it's easy to move fast and then burn yourself out. And it's like, we have to
It's so easy.
Slow down a little bit.
I've burnt out a few times. A few times. And there were people there to help me. There were people there to make space for me. And in those moments, that's when I knew that liberation was possible. Because we're going to fuck up. You know, like we're going to there. If there was a map to this shit, we would already done it. We're gonna
Right.
mess up. We're in this maze. We're gonna hit a wall. We're gonna run into each other. You know, we're gonna try things that don't make sense. Like we're gonna disagree. I think we should go to the left. I think we should go to the right. No, we should just keep going forward. Well, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that, and it doesn't work. But if there is a commitment, if you click that box, you got to keep coming back to it. You know, like you got to keep coming back to it, and that's a humbling process, is to come back to it, to say, yeah, you know, I let it get the best of me. My ego got in the way.
Right.
You know, like something you did made me angry, and my anger got in the way. Money got in the way. And what we allow it to do is to completely destroy us.
Yep.
It will completely destroy us. And then what do we have? That's what I keep thinking about in this moment. What will we have if we tear it all down? Because white supremacy and capitalism will still be here. And we torn down one of the vehicles that we built ourselves to get to the other side.
And I really hope that folks are listening to this and being able to hear just the, like, it actually just takes us slowing down and being reflective.
It's being like, listen, I don't know why I never had a one-on-one with you.
Right.
Let's talk, because it feels like we think about each other in a way that I'm not seeing you in your fullness, and you're not seeing me in mine.
Yeah. Well, and also recognize that social media has a louder bark than its bite, and that's always a thing. And it continues to be a trickster to keep from really building relationships. And I think the ways that it impacts modern day movement, that's so apparent.
Why organization is key, right? I think about the most impactful things I've ever said have never been in 140 characters. The most impactful things I've ever did can't be written in 150 characters. There are so many words that get left out just to get that tweet under the character limit to press send. And I know how important Twitter was to Ferguson, right? We got to tell our story. We got to combat mainstream media, but we don't build movements on Twitter.
Yeah.
You can inspire people, but then you got to move them.
Right.
Right. And when we move them from liking something to signing up for something, to attending something, to becoming a member of an organization, in those spaces, that is where accountability lives. It lives between people who have relationship. If we keep letting the way that social media creates personalities to outweigh what it means, like if we keep letting social media build brands instead of organizations building movement, then that's why I feel so rough right now. That's why I feel so rough right now, because we're not actually equating. I don't want people to be like, Kayla did a lot, X, Y, and Z. Kayla didn't close the workhouse, right? Action St. Louis did. Did I help start it? Am I in leadership of it? Yes.
Right.
That work, what it produces every day, that is not Kayla. I am a steward. Like I am in service of the work. And I think we have to start asking, how does this serve the work? Because if it's truly about accountability, if it's truly about transparency, if it's truly about recalibrating to steward better, that can't happen on Twitter. That's not what Twitter is for. And if you're a real organizer, you wouldn't use a tactic that wouldn't help you produce the benefit, the outcome that you wanted to see in the first place. I wouldn't tell people to close a jail. You need to vote for the school board.
Right.
That's not the right tactic for the strategy that we need or the outcome that we want to see.
Right. Thank you, Kayla, so much for all of this. The last thing, not that I want to put you in 140 characters, but that we are asking everybody, you know, in a phrase or a couple sentences, what's being said but remains unheard?
That's a really good question. What's being said that remains unheard? You know what we say a lot in this movement? It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It's a duty. It is something, it is a commitment that we make to do every single day. It's our responsibility to fight for our freedom, to get that part right. Right. Those words, when I first heard them, I was in Ferguson, and I remember that I felt goosebumps, right? Like, who said that? Where did that come from? So I'm just like Asada Shakur. And I was like, I'm gonna tell you the truth. I didn't know who she was. I was like, who's that? And as I have learned and grown in my own way, those 4 lines we say them so powerfully, but it's not heard, right? We keep saying it, but we haven't heard the mandate in that. There's our duty to win, which means we can't sacrifice what we have built for anything other than winning, right? For our freedom, like winning our freedom. That is the goal. And I think we overlook that part, right? That like, we must love and support each other. There's no condition on that, is what my dad would say, right? If he was preaching, there's no condition on that. It can't be, we will love and support each other if we get along. We will love and support each other if we agree. We will love and support each other if you follow me. There are no words after that. It just is that we will love and support each other. So, and I think that the last thing I'll say about that is that I think the most important piece that's connected to this conversation in that phrase, in that chant, in that mandate is our. Our is plural. It is more than one. It is not my duty to fight for our freedom. It is ours. I cannot do it alone. We should not do it alone. And we will not win alone.
Thank you for listening. For more conversations like this one, visit forageorganizing.org. We'll see you on Twitter @forageorganizing. For more information on Black Visions, visit blackvisionsmn.org or follow them on Twitter @blackvisionsmn. You can find more information on Liberation in a Generation at liberationinageneration.org or follow them on Twitter @liberationin. Thank you to Nino Fernandez for post-production audio and editing. And thanks to all of you for listening. Take care and stay safe, everyone.